Hi everyone. Thank you for joining me once again to tour an exciting new exhibit at the California Museum, Fight for the Right. 100 years ago, our nation boldly undertook the single largest expansion of democracy in our history. After decades of struggles and setbacks, American women secured the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment on this exact day, August 26, 1920. Now, of course, we know that the mission was far from complete that day, that women of color had to fight for many more years to gain full access to their constitutional right to vote. And yet, with this signature from the U.S. Secretary of State, American women were able to give new meaning to our nation's founding ideals, having achieved a major victory in our march towards a more perfect union. Now, last year I toured the National Archives Suffrage exhibit in Washington, D.C. as a member of the National Suffrage Commission, and I was so moved by the common threads that bind the early suffragists to our current women's movement today. There, I saw over 100-year-old posters demanding equal pay for equal work. I saw op-eds in newspapers asking for legal protections against domestic violence. I saw pictures of women who were the first ever White House protesters wearing "Vote for Women" sashes that could easily have been turned into pink you-know-what hats. And as I walked the halls of the National Archives, I saw myself in these women. I saw my mother, my grandmothers, my sisters. I saw all of you. And I was overwhelmed both by how much progress had been made and how much further we still have to go. And that is why we worked so hard to bring this exhibit here to you in California. An exhibit that highlights not just the suffragists of the 18 and 1900s, but all the women who came after, the women who are still marching, speaking out, and leading today. We stand on the shoulders of so many incredible women, women who recognize that the passing of the 19th Amendment was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long road toward a more just, more fair, more equal America. Now, I know this exhibit will inspire you as it inspires me, so let's go check it out. So this was an original banner used by women in the 1917 White House protests. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party actually utilized these. What's really interesting is that the use of these in the protests, although albeit silent, were deemed unpatriotic because World War I was going on, and their demonstrations sparked a lot of controversy. Over the 2.5-year protests, many of the nearly 2,000 picketers were harassed and arrested. But they did it, and look where we are, right? So this section is all about the features and tactics of the movement. Women drove across the country and state, they spoke at rallies around the world, and continued to bring suffrage amendments forward. And what was really interesting to me is how hard, for example, the women fought in the state of California. In fact, the first statewide vote for suffrage failed to pass in 1896. And after a progressive administration swept power in 1910, it was only then that the suffragists had 8 months to mobilize a massive campaign, which is why California women were able to vote in 1911, prior to the 19th Amendment. So, obviously times have changed. We had our first phone here, and then as we progressed to our cell phones, as we know, mobilization looks quite different today than it did then, but we're still marching. And I think our marches have been quite successful. So this exhibit demonstrates another tactic that women used. The suffragists were really strategic about their public image. They embraced modest clothing that covered them from head to toe so as not to appear too threatening. They wanted to convey an image of purity and hope, and they wore white. I'm wearing white for you all today as well. Even today, we're using those same tactics. And if you look at historically women in leadership, in 1968, Shirley Chisholm wore white on the night she was elected as the first Black woman in Congress. Geraldine Ferraro followed suit at the 1984 Democratic National Convention as the first female vice presidential nominee of a major party. And on Election Day in 2016, many women wore white to the polls as they voted for Hillary Clinton. What's interesting, and you may not know this, is despite all of these gains in terms of women's representation, the US still ranks 75th out of 193 countries around the world when it comes to women's representation in government. It's not great, it's kind of depressing, but this solidarity has continued over the years. Most recently, during the State of the Union address in 2020, all the congressional women wore white, and our friend from California, our Representative Doris Matsui, actually wore this white suit, and we're lucky to have a special message from her here today.
Hi, I'm Doris Matsui, and I'm here at this wonderful California museum touring this exhibit. It's really wonderful. Fight for the Right, 100 Years, the Women's Vote. You know, it's 100 years, and so much has happened in 100 years. The interesting thing is that 100 years ago, we had a pandemic, and the women were fighting for the vote then. 100 years later, we have another pandemic. And even though we have the right to vote, not everyone has the right to vote. So women, as we always said, we persist. We are continually fighting for the vote for everyone. And there's one thing that we've learned as women, and that we fought for this right. We fought hard for this right. And we don't want anyone to think that we're not still fighting. We should never take our vote for granted. This is a wonderful country, but let's ensure that it stays that way by voting for all the things we believe in. So you must come tour this wonderful California Museum exhibit, virtually now because of the pandemic, but you can see it starting from August 26th. And you will see snippets of this, and it will be really wonderful. Because when you think about the future, you understand that the future is only secured if we vote. So please, make sure that your vote counts.
So let's learn a little bit more. One of my favorite parts of this exhibit are the arguments for or against why women should retain the right to vote. So in favor of women having the right to vote, the argument was that women are at least equal to men intellectually and superior morally, that they should not be subject to taxation without representation, and that places that have already had women's suffrage actually benefit from it. Now, some of the arguments against women having the right to vote is that women needed to properly care for their homes and children and didn't have the time to vote, that women lacked the mental capacity to offer a useful opinion about political matters, and that voting would lead to women competing with men. Crazy. But what's really cool and interesting here, especially as a Californian, is that when California won the right to vote for women in 1911, the numbers of women voting doubled. So really, as California went, so went the nation, because California's support for women voting really spurred greater movement across the country in terms of the suffrage movement. And the Midwest and the East decided they really needed to get in line and follow. Go California. The exhibit takes you through a history of what it was like to vote in different eras. Beside me, you can see a mechanical voting booth, which was used in the 70s for the Ford versus Carter election. Let's just say I am glad that I don't have to vote in one of these. The technology has obviously gotten a lot easier. In fact, now in California, every eligible voter can vote by mail. So this timeline really puts into perspective the 19th Amendment. We know that not all women received the right to vote in 1920, that it wasn't until 1952 that immigrants of Asian descent could receive the right to vote. In 1948, American Indians had the right to vote in US elections, but it wasn't really until 1962 that American Indian women could legally vote in all states. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned literacy tests and gave the Justice Department wide authority to deter discrimination so that most Black women could finally vote in 1965. But as we know, in 2020, barriers to fair elections still exist. Activities at local levels make it very hard for disenfranchised people to exercise their rights to vote. Voters face challenges like registration hurdles, identification requirements, inconvenient polling places, that's a big one, and unfair district boundaries. So we have a lot of work to do. And in the final section of the exhibit, you get to walk through a hall of inspirational California women. Women like Speaker Pelosi and Charlotta Spears Bass, the first Black woman to own and operate a newspaper in the United States. And then you can contribute to the exhibit by sharing who inspires you. At the most recent Democratic National Convention, former President Barack Obama spoke about his hero, the late John Lewis, and said that John Lewis is proof that what we do echoes for generations. And he is right. What these women accomplished 100 years ago created echoes that have led all the way to this moment, all the way to me, and all of the way to you. And now it is up to us to keep that fight going. It is up to us to vote, because as these women showed us, we must never take that sacred right for granted. And it is up to us to do all that we can to continue to lift up women's voices, women's contributions, and women's leadership. Because our voices are important and valuable. Our experiences are unique and must be listened to and believed. And when our voices and experiences are valued, and when our needs, not just my needs, but the needs of all women, especially the most marginalized women, are listened to and prioritized, and when a plurality of diverse women have seats at the tables of power, entire families, communities, and our society will be better off. So thank you once more for joining me to celebrate the Suffrage Centennial and to tour the new Fight for the Right exhibit at the California Museum. I can't wait to have you all here in person, and in the meantime, please check out californiamuseum.org for more information. Onwards.